Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Electronic Licensing and Hearings Committee. Due to COVID-19 pandemic, the committee is practicing physical distancing. I would like to acknowledge the land on which we gather virtually today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today, their achievements, and their contributions to our community. I would now ask the clerk to do roll call.
Thank you. Regional Chair Redmond.
Present.
Councillor Armstrong.
Present.
Councillor Clark.
Present.
Councillor Erb.
Present.
And regrets from Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you very much. I would now ask if there are any declarations of pecuniary interest under the Conflict of Interest Act. Seeing none, I would like to address delegations, and then we will call on Albert Hoving to give us an update before we actually hear them. We have 6 delegations, each of whom is getting 5 minutes to speak. And I would just remind all delegations that some guidelines in preparation for their intervention. Please leave your video and camera off and your microphone and audio muted until you're called upon to speak. If you conduct yourself in any of the following manners, it will result in immediate removal from the meeting. Interrupting councillors, staff, or other delegations, derogatory statements about councillors, staff, or others, turning your camera on at inappropriate times, or any hate speech or defamatory comments. So before we hear from the delegations, I'm not sure of the number. I have 2 different numbers here. It's 6. Okay, thank you. We will hear a report on 515 Herbs Road Woodlot Removal Permit application, and I would ask Albert Hoving to provide some opening remarks. So welcome, Albert. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Chair Redmond. So I'll briefly go through the material in the report. I'll share my screen. I've got a number of images. All right. So the report deals with a woodland removal permit at 515 Herbsville Road in Waterloo. This permit's applied for under the region's woodland conservation bylaw, bylaw 08026, and that bylaw is enabled by the Municipal Act 2001. The bylaw regulates destruction or injuring of trees in a woodland, and the purpose of the bylaw is to sustain a healthy natural environment while also having regard to good forestry practices. So it's a forestry related permit that deals with forestry and forest management. So permits may be required for cutting trees in woodlands that are greater than 1 hectare. We generally issue what are called good forestry practices permits. Those deal with forest harvesting and management. Those permits are submitted by and or approved by a registered professional forester. The permit that we have before us today is a woodland removal permit. It's one of 3 different kinds of permits that we have. This permit allows for the removal of a designated woodland if injuring or destruction of the tree or trees is desirable for the appropriate development or use of the property. And as part of that, the general intent and purpose of the bylaw must be maintained. So again, sustaining a healthy natural environment while also having regard to good forestry practices. So this is the west side of Waterloo. I made my cursor a little bit bigger. Hopefully it shows up well. So this is Herbsville Road here. We've got Laurelwood Crescent here, or Laurelwood Drive. We have Wideman Road, Wilmot Line, and then Columbia Street is over here. The property in question is outlined in white. So it faces out onto Herbsville Road and extends back quite a ways. The property is about a little bit over 10 hectares, so 25 acres or so in size. I thought what I would do for context is I would just sort of show you the different environmentally sensitive policy areas throughout that area. The west side of Waterloo, there are quite a few of them. They're also highlighted in green here as they are in the official plan. I've put numbers on there just so that you see that there are different ESPAs. They're not all. They look like one large blob, but they do have different characteristics. They were identified at different times, which is why they're named and different. So you can see we're up at Laurel Creek Conservation Area here, and again, stretching out into Wilmot, across Wilmot line. As well, we've got a designation, core environmental feature, woodlands, and I'll pull that up now. And I don't know if you noticed that change, but for the most part, they overlap, and a lot of the ESPA areas are woodlands. And you can see that property, I'll just go back again to ESPA, and if you watch the property at 515 Herbsville, you'll notice that green line stays the same. So the area of permit application is crosshatched here it's the front part or the eastern part of the property. It's a little bit over 3.5 hectares. So just sort of set the distinction between the two different areas. So at the back of the property, again in green, we have the significant woodland or ESPA. These designations both preclude woodland clearing, particularly for development purposes. So those areas are protected under the official plan. On this particular property at 515 Herbsville, we have issued a number of permits over the past 20 years for good forestry practices. So they've been harvesting and managing the woodlot at the back there, and we have issued permits. And in this area, we have a mature mixed hardwood forest. It's healthy, it's vigorous, and it's self-sustaining. It's a very nice woodlot. Up at the front, the area in question, it's plantation. It was established in the late 1970s. So plantations were usually established as a form of a crop, a very slow crop, but the idea was that there would be some sort of economic return from them. And this particular owner planted this plantation in the late 1970s. There's a very distinct difference in appearance between this plantation area and the significant woodland. Species composition, the arrangement of the trees and the spacing is very different. It's not a natural appearing forest at all. It is definitely a plantation. Likewise, the ground vegetation isn't similar to a natural woodland. Grasses, there's raspberries. Much of the area has been mowed regularly by the owner to keep trails open through there for recreational use and just sort of keep things down a little bit. There has been some management activity in this area. Hazard and dead trees have been removed. Although the plantation was established primarily, I think, for white pine lumber and black walnut lumber in the late 70s, walnut was a very valuable tree species, and a lot of plantations had them in there with the hopes that they would be able to harvest them for economic return. Unfortunately, a lot of the walnut trees suffer from canker diseases, which makes them much less desirable for lumber. And same with the white pine. If you want really high quality white pine lumber, they do need to be managed. They should be pruned and thinned and maintained. And the plantation wasn't maintained in that manner throughout time. So many of the trees, including the white pine, red oak, and black walnut, are showing signs of decline and deterioration. As well, there was a lot of ash that had seeded in over the years, and of course, the emerald ash borer has taken care of those. So a lot of the smaller ash have died, and there were some larger ones, but they were removed recently because they were hazardous. So I thought I'd zoom in a little bit on the property. And again, you can see the outline in white. You can see, so this is ESPA 19, and it's also that core environmental feature woodland. If I pull that coloration off, you can see the difference in appearance between this ESPA area and here's the plantation. And you can see that these trees are planted in rows, particularly in this area. When you get to the front of the property, they're a little bit more haphazard, but that's because a lot of the trees have died over time and you can't really see the rows that well anymore. And this is the current residence on the property. So as part of the permit application, there are certain areas that are excluded from the request for removal. Some were by the proponent, some we added on sort of for further consideration. So there's a 10-meter wide strip between the core environmental feature and the plantation where they're proposing to remove. That 10-meter buffer zone is pretty typical. What we put on core environmental features sort of between the feature and a development area. And that area is proposed then for future enhancement and improvement through plantings and some management and maintenance. And the idea would be that that would be done later on as they proceed with development on that property. In addition to that 10-meter buffer area, we're excluding two 15-meter wide zones down the north and south property lines. And again, the thinking is here that when they get farther in development plans, there may be opportunity to save trees in that area. So rather than removing them at this point, we would wait, and as they go through development plans with the City of Waterloo, that they would develop a management plan for the vegetation management plan for the area. As well, somewhere in the center of the property, roughly adjacent to the house, there's a seepage area. That area needs a bit of further study, and environmental impact study should be done. So we've excluded that from the removal area as well. And the idea is that, again, rather than taking machinery through there with removals, it'd be set aside until further studies can be done and addressed later on. So the recommendation in the report is that the Regional Municipality of Waterloo issue a woodland removal permit to Russ Howald for the removal of approximately 3.65 hectares of black walnut white pine plantation located at 515 Herbsville Road, subject to the following conditions, and those conditions are described in a little bit more detail in the report. 15-meter strip be retained around the seepage area. So that was the last one that I mentioned. So until an EIS is completed to the satisfaction of the City of Waterloo environmental planning staff. A 15-meter strip be retained along the north and south property boundaries in order that these areas can be evaluated in conjunction with the future development application through a vegetation management plan. But a 10-meter buffer is established at the west end of the plantation, adjacent to the core environmental feature forest, with the understanding that this buffer is to be enhanced with native tree and shrub species plantings in a manner to be determined through the future development planning process. And also that all of these buffer areas and retained areas are to be flagged and clearly demarcated to the satisfaction of regional staff prior to the commencement of any tree removals. So that would be done in the field to the satisfaction of regional staff. Another consideration is that woodland removal activities be undertaken in compliance with the Migratory Birds Convention Act, ideally during the non-breeding winter period. When you do a large-scale removal like this, it could have an impact if there were migratory birds breeding in this area. So during the winter, when the breeding activity doesn't occur, is an ideal time to do it. It can be done at different times of the year, but that requires a breeding bird survey to be done by a qualified person. But again, it's best in the winter. Also, that all woodland removal activities be undertaken in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. If there is habitat on the property that could be suitable for endangered species, that further study be done just to make sure that any requirements of the ESA are met. And finally, that this permit does not pertain to stump removals and or site grading. The City of Waterloo has a site alteration bylaw that would come into effect if somebody were to do large-scale stump removals or grading. So this permit does not give permission to do that work. That would have to be done under agreement with the city of Waterloo. So that's the essence of the report and the permit application. So I will stop sharing. And I don't know if there's questions or if you want to proceed to delegations.
Thank you very much, Albert. I would ask colleagues, are there any questions of Mr. Hoving, or we will go to the delegations? Any clarity required at this point in time? Go ahead, Councillor Erb.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm wondering, Albert, if you could put that map up again. There's the 15-meter buffer along the north and south sides of the property.
Okay, just gotta pull this back up again for a second. I seem to have lost it.
Albert, do you want the clerk to see if they can pull up the slide?
I should be able to get it here in a minute. Just,
Okay.
And the question can wait, Madam Chair, till after. We don't have to take time right now until they find it. Maybe it got lost in the trees.
yeah. I think you're seeing it now.
It says, yeah.
Yeah, I just have to get the right slide here for a minute. This one?
Yeah, that's close. So inside the property line where it's been the plantation, where you can see the trees that are planted in rows.
Yes.
The intent would be that they would be all removed or parts of them.
It's my understanding that they would essentially be looking at removing most of them. There may be a few areas where they would retain some, but that property is really hilly. Like there's a lot of elevation change in there. Yeah. So there likely wouldn't be a lot of opportunity for retention in that center area, the plantation area here. Mm-hmm. Possibly some along these 15-meter strips, which is why we're excluding them sort of wholesale at this point.
Okay, I went out to the site, and it's a hard site to get access to get a good handle right. on what it is, and so that any potential redevelopment that would include residential, would that come? I think it's in that would not come off of Herbsville Road. Is that correct?
I believe not. You'd probably have to ask the consultant who's here, but I believe that the road access would be sort of across the center through here. Yeah.
Okay. And the if I may, one more question: the fencing that has been installed around the property, is that around the exterior of the buffer zone?
The fencing back here.
Oh, is that
through here? Through here, yeah. So I don't think there's fencing. The fencing goes along here and along here. Okay. There's no fencing in here.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Thank you, Albert. Thank you for screen sharing. You can take that down. And we will now welcome our delegations. And again, each delegation has 5 minutes. The first is Douglas Stewart, IBI Group, and Jeff Gross, WSP. Welcome, you have the floor.
Thank you. And to the chair and to the members, I'm Douglas Stewart. Also joining me today is Mr. Jeff Gross of WSP. I will keep our comments short and brief. We are here in support of what staff have recommended. It reflects the request. It reflects what the applicant is asking for. We firmly believe that the staff report is quite clear that the intent is to remove a portion of the plantation and does not touch the forest at all, and in fact provides for some further protection of that edge. We have reviewed the report, the recommendation, and the requirements of this request, and we are in support. That's all I wish to speak to. We feel this request is at the appropriate point of time, and we ask that you support what staff are recommending.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Gross, do you have anything to add, or you're here to answer any hard questions?
I'm here to answer the hard questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So you are both speaking in support of the recommendations from staff. Any questions of clarification from council? Seeing none, thank you very much. Thank you for being focused and brief in your comments. And the next delegation is Brock Howie from Waterloo. Brock, are you with us?
Good afternoon. Yes, I'm here.
Welcome. You have 5 minutes and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson, members of the committee. Thank you for your time to hear me today. Mr. Hoving, I appreciate very much your synopsis and graphics that helped digest many pages of material for us in a helpful fashion. My name is Brock Howie. I'm a resident of Waterloo. I live on Red Osier Road, my property backs onto the core environmental forest within 5 minutes of the subject property. I think we can all agree that our green spaces, in particular our natural forests in Waterloo, they're a blessing to us and something that enhances the quality of life for not just residents like me who back onto it, but everyone in the city who makes tremendous use of the facilities, the forest, the environment. The last year and a half, 2 years of the pandemic has seen a massive increase in the use of these green spaces for pedestrians, for cyclists, for skiers, for dog walkers, we had the chamber choir singing there this fall in the forest. Anything that we do with a view to taking down forests, I hope we all view with a very cautious approach, and we should lean, I believe, to preserving forests rather than tearing it down for development. I have a great deal of concern that the development of the subject property is only going to further accelerate the deterioration of the core environmental feature. I appreciate the arborist's comments that what we're looking at proposing to remove is not the same as the original forest. However, it helps to buffer and protect the original forest, so its loss will not be a net zero to the forest. I don't believe. The reports from WSP and IBI that were available for today's meeting certainly answered a lot of the questions when I initially sought to speak at the December 7th hearing of this matter. But really, my question is, if it's proposed that a certain portion of the property be retained pending future environmental impact survey, why do we allow the removal of a substantial amount of vegetation when before doing that study? Like, why not do the study and then you can assess whether, removing all these trees is going to have a significant detrimental effect to the subject area. I mean, the retention pond or in the middle of the property, isolating it by removing all the trees around it is de facto saying we're going to remove it later. We're saving time. I'm not even really sure why. Perhaps someone could answer that question. I have another question about the subject property. As the illustration showed, it extends considerably further west into the core environmental feature. Are there any plans for that particular parcel of the property? if we have a subdivision going in the middle of the property, doesn't that suggest that there's some risk there? I'd be curious to know. I'd also just like to know if there already is a plan of subdivision for the property once the trees are removed. Anyway, mostly it was questions that I had. If anyone's able to answer them, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. Are there any questions of the delegation? Councillor Clark.
Thanks, Chair. They're not really of the delegation, but I do have a question of clarification that sort of relates to what the delegation has said, and I wonder if this is the time that staff can answer.
We usually like to keep delegation questions during the delegation period, but I mean, this is licensing and hearing. It's not a full-blown council meeting. So if it's a question of clarification, I think you could go ahead and ask.
Thank you. It is a question of clarification, but it's about the region's role versus the city's role in this overall initiative. My understanding is that we're really involved with the woodland clearing application, but it's the city that deals with the the EIS and other things. But is that correct? How do the two bodies work together, and where's our piece?
I think Kate Hagerman has joined us to answer that question of clarification.
Yes, thank you. And Albert might have more specific information than I do, but yes, it's there is a separation in terms of our roles with this property. This is an app under the tree bylaw and is not tied to an imminent development application, although it is recognized that this property is designated for development, and that has been acknowledged as part of the permitting process.
And so does the city, or has the city had any input in this application?
Yes, through the chair, we've circulated the permit application to the city, and they did have input, and actually some of the recommendations are at their request.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. Any further questions? I have one of clarification. Mr. Howie, are you still on the line?
Yes, I am, Madam Chair.
So it sounds to me like there's public access to this land, although it's been applied for by obviously a landowner. So are you saying that you, as a member of the public, you've had access to this woodlot?
Not the subject parcel, but it integrates with community trails in and around. The perimeter of the property has some about five or 6 foot high fencing, so woodland fencing all around it. The owner of the property seems to have declared an intent to keep the public off of his land, so to speak. But there are trails that go all the way around the property. I expect that if the subdivision goes in the area that's the subject of the application, that will permit additional traffic to essentially circumnavigate the whole property more than it already does, because he has this property that goes right to Herbsville Road. He has the ability to exclude cross traffic except to the west of the westerly limit of the property. And I just don't know what the plan is in the long run. Does this person maintain ownership of a piece of forest? Does it become part of the sort of greater forest trail area without exclusive fences that impede the movement of fauna throughout? So to answer your question directly, no, I've not been on the subject property because the owner has maintained a fence.
Thank you. Albert, do you want to add anything? I saw you vigorously nodding your head. I'm assuming Mr. Howie is giving an accurate, to your estimation, response to whether it's public or private.
That's correct. The property is fenced all the way around. And yeah, that has to do with sort of trespass issues and that. And I don't know what the future of that piece at the back would be. That would sort of be worked out through the development agreement with the city. Often those sorts of areas do sort of become city property, and the city owns most of that ESPA at this point already. So again, I don't know exactly what the plans are, but that would seem a possibility.
Thank you. I see no further questions. So thank you, Mr. Howie. Yen Wong from Waterloo. Okay. We don't see anyone in the waiting room. Next delegation is Kevin Tomlinson, Vice Chair, Grand River Environmental Work. Welcome, Kevin. You have 5 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you. Honorable Chair, committee members, and guests. My name is Kevin Thomason, and I am the owner of 1115 Cedar Grove Road, Waterloo. I'm speaking today in my capacity as Vice Chair of the Grand River Environmental Network, a longstanding community organization of individuals and community groups. This issue was actually brought to our attention from a national environmental group based in Vancouver. When activities in our own community are being noticed 4,000 kilometers away, it has to be either something really good or something really bad. At a time when planting a few trees in Waterloo Park on Earth Day makes headlines, the thoughts of clearing 9 acres of forest within the city is horrific. We're in a climate emergency with just 96 months to meet our Paris Accord targets and carbon reductions of 50%. One of the leading strategies for addressing climate change is tree planting on a massive scale. There are objectives to see 25% of our lands protected and returned to nature by 2025 and 30% by 2030, according to Accord objectives. And Canada is not on track to meet these goals with less than 20% protection currently. Locally, there are goals for tree canopy coverage of 30% to help offset pollution, provide fresh air, ensure natural habitat, and to help cool increasing summer heat waves. Yet in Waterloo region, we sit at about 17% coverage, far below this goal, and clearing these lands will set us back even further. I live near this property and I pass by it regularly. The ESPAs, the PSWs, the Laurel Creek Headwaters, ESL, the countryside line and protected countryside and many other local features are very familiar, as I have volunteered full-time for years to protect and preserve this amazing natural area. While I acknowledge the easternmost forest here may not currently be the greatest quality, it could be in a few decades. There are good seeds planted here, and nature is quickly filling in the missing components of a diverse ecosystem. Very nearby, we now have bald eagles successfully nesting for the past 2 years. Many rare and endangered and regionally significant species are found in this area. I even just recently had to stop for foxes and deer to cross the road in front of this property, as there is a very important wildlife corridor here, connecting these western ESPA areas to the Laurel Creek Conservation Area and protected forests to the east. While I appreciate the efforts to preserve 2 15-meter buffers on the north and south sides of this property to be clear-cut, given the significant topology and the extreme grading of slopes on this property that is going to be required to connect it to the neighborhoods to the north and to the south, I question if any of these buffers will remain intact and if a better plan isn't needed to ensure essential connectivity for nature. We can't allow the Laurel Creek Conservation Area to become an isolated island with no connectivity, and this is one of the last key remaining corridors. From the Adirondacks to Algonquin, from Yellowstone to the Yukon, the importance of wildlife corridors are increasingly being recognized, and a long-term plan to ensure natural connectivity with generous buffers is certainly required here. We recognize that the many conflicting priorities with this property. Its ideal location right in the city on major public transit routes, adjacent to shops and schools and so many services, makes it so compelling for development, creating a smart growth, walkable community. The ability to tie into adjacent neighborhoods, connect roads and sidewalks so children don't have to venture onto busy regional arterial roads to walk to school is compelling. Building within the existing urban area may prevent sprawling onto essential rural farmland elsewhere and could be deemed by many to be good planning. However, as I have stated, the proposal to clear-cut an entire forest abounding with so much wildlife in the face of our climate crisis is horrifying. How many Canadians have ever seen a bright blue little indigo bunting? We appreciate the amazing stewardship of the landowner, his honesty and his approach to things. We don't want to set precedents here that would discourage others from stewardship and reforesting their lands. We also need to acknowledge that while this forest has many merits, it pales in comparison to the spectacular hardwood forest of the ESPA area to the west, also owned by Mr. Howald. These other 14 acres of old growth forest, along with an adjacent 11-acre parcel, we need to ensure are protected for perpetuity. We may have to accept the loss of this front 9 acres. However, perhaps the condition is for the next anticipated stack of development approvals is to ensure that this incredible hardwood forest and groundwater recharge becomes part of the ESL with adjustments to the countryside line and the protected countryside to guarantee protection for generations to come. I would have to caution that even within the proposed 9 acres to be clear cut, there is a significant portion of the western part that is far more in common and is almost indistinguishable from the ESPA hardwood forest, as you can see in photos that I'll send as part of our follow-up. There should be far more significant buffers to the west, greater than 10 or 15 meters, perhaps a buffer of at least 150 meters that would better align with Blue Beach Park and the streets to the north and better handle the topology of this area with the serious hills. In conclusion, this is a troubling proposal with so many aspects to consider. It's hard to explain how 9 acres can be clear-cut in advance of any environmental assessment. What could possibly be left to assess? While it would be unfortunate to lose this 9 acres of forest, hopefully generous wildlife corridors and a well-planned, sustainable neighborhood that integrates extremely well into the surrounding urban and rural fabric would result. The real tragedy would be if something was to ever happen to the old growth hardwood forest to the west, also currently owned by this applicant. We must ensure their permanent protection as a condition of approval here or however possible, along with ensuring that nothing done here will compromise them in any way, requiring far better buffering. Hopefully, we can successfully find the sustainable urban and rural balance that our future generations will require. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You already answered my question when you talked about generous buffers. So you're saying a generous buffer would be 150 meters as opposed to the proposed 15?
Yeah, somewhere along there. And what that does is that better aligns it with the park to the north. And therefore, you've got residential streets lining up with residential streets. And it's probably not an accident that we see that blue park to the north where it is. Then again, just due to the hills, the topology. And, I think that's something I can't state enough. The two-dimensional aerial photos and maps of this property don't show what a mountain it is. This is truly one of the highest, it's the pinnacle of one of the highest points in the region. When you climb up, although you can't get onto the property to the fence, even if you climb up to the fence, it's a several-story climb up just from the adjacent subdivision, and you have a commanding view. Forget just seeing all through the region. You look all the way to Guelph, all the way far to the almost Mount Forest to the north. It is impressive how high this property is. And there will be some impressive geography to overcome. We saw when Columbia Forest subdivision was built, Columbia Forest 1 to the south, as well as Columbia Forest 2 and 3 to the north. There was significant, literally 3 years worth of grading required before any building permits and foundations went into the ground. And there will be significant challenges to grade and handle the topology here. And that's part of my concern. If we focus these two buffers or what could be future wildlife corridors only on the north and south fringes, the areas that are likely going to have to be the most graded to try to somehow blend these communities together, I'm not quite sure any of them are going to survive that. And this is where I almost wonder if there isn't a better opportunity here, tying into that wetland in the middle that we already know, that big square that Albert had on his map, to somehow create a corridor through the middle of the property that may even integrate ultimately better with parkland or stormwater management or whatever the community. That stuff we don't know yet and we won't see. And it's unfortunate that we have to approve this tree cutting before so much in the future is known. That even comes back to the point of the environmental assessment after the horse has left the barn here. But hopefully there will be ways that we can best engineer the remaining strips that are left to the areas that are most likely to actually remain the most intact in the property over the long term, not the areas most likely to be graded.
Thank you very much. I see no further questions, so thank you very much, Kevin, for coming in. And
excellent. Thank you.
The next delegation, Martin Kuda from Waterloo. Martin, you have 5 minutes.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. would like to thank Albert for his good presentation. And I would like to just agree that I support what Brock and Kevin are saying. I don't think I'm as well spoken as they are, but I really appreciate all the thought and communication that they've shared with us. I'm on a property that is in the southeast corner, adjacent to the property in question, and the black walnut trees that border the driveway, they overhang substantially the property that I'm on and all of the adjacent properties along that border. And I'm just, for one, curious because the map that was provided in the communication doesn't show this, and it doesn't agree with what Albert showed on his presentation. But I'm just curious if the 15-meter retention area extends to the east of the home on the subject property to Herbsville Road, because that's where the property I'm on exists. And so I'd like to get some clarification there. And I'd also just like to kind of mirror what Kevin was saying, that really there's a lot of wildlife that I see every day wandering through that property. I see foxes. I've seen, all kinds of birds, red-tailed hawks. I had it confirmed yesterday by one of these bird experts that a picture I'd taken just on the weekend was of great horned owls that were in the trees. Even though it's a plantation, and I can't really see that it's a plantation from my property, but I definitely know that wildlife has adopted that plantation as its home. So regardless of whether it's a plantation or a natural forest, there is wildlife there. They are using it as a corridor, and it's a very active corridor. And I think that needs to be considered from the perspective of developing the area. But I also want to take a broader perspective on the development of our community, because I shared in a letter that I wrote in, our region is almost as big as London, England. London, England has 9 million people. We have just over 500,000. Why are we having to develop greenfield sites for our community at this point? We don't have enough people. We need to increase the density of already existing areas. And in order to ensure that we meet our climate objectives, because this is a climate crisis, the next decade is going to require change like no one has seen before. And we need to really take a look at the old stock of residential and commercial buildings for redevelopment into higher efficiency, higher value properties that are higher density. We need to basically protect the lands we have. These woodlots are often just the fragmented remains of what was once a great forest in Ontario. I think I may have found something called golden seal on the property. I'm not 100% sure, but it is only found on 24 woodlots in Ontario now. And, that says something, because it's probably not the only threatened species out there. And we need to take more action to protect what we have left. And so I would like to see us look at other alternatives for development before we look at developing woodlots. If you look at what's happening around the world, there's a reason why these viruses are jumping from the wilderness into the human population. It's because we're crowding out wilderness. 96% of the biomass of mammals on this planet are 3 species: humans, cows, and pigs. There's only 4% of the biomass of mammals that are basically what we call wildlife. And we need to pay more attention to this, because as we crowd them out, these viruses are going to jump into our population more and more. This pandemic isn't the last. And so from that perspective as well, we have to lead the way and set an example for other regions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you for being so astute at watching your timing. That was well done. Any questions of the delegation, colleagues? Councillor Erb, do you have a question? Go ahead. Do you have a mouse that's not cooperating?
Exactly, sorry. I'm wondering if Albert could respond to the question that Mr. Cooter raised about the black walnuts along that line of property.
Albert, are you in a position to respond?
Is the question sort of about the extension of that buffer strip all the way basically up to Herbsville Road?
Yes.
Yes.
So the original request for the removal of the plantation sort of excluded around the house there. I drew those lines on those buffer strips just so that we've got a continuous line all the way along the property boundary. Just so that it's flagged when people are doing tree removals, it's not unknown for them to sort of miss the starting point. So I thought err on the side of caution and just put that buffer all the way down to the end, even though it's not actually within the proposed area for removal. So it's just a precautionary piece to make sure we've got the entire thing flagged.
Thank you.
So further to Councillor Erb's question and Mr. Kuta's concern, who would make the discernment about whether or not that buffer zone actually went right out to Herbsville Road?
That would be me in consultation with the proponent. So I imagine it would probably be WSP and myself, and we would go out and actually flag that entire stretch all the way down.
Okay. Thank you very much. The next delegation is Rebecca from Waterloo. Rebecca, welcome. You have 5 minutes. And Rebecca's not with us. That actually is all of our delegations, and I know it's later in the agenda, but we received quite a bit of correspondence, and I know Mr. Kuta mentioned that he too had sent some correspondence in. I actually have a couple of questions that I would like to ask. I don't know if these are for Kate or for Albert, and I don't know if colleagues have questions, so please indicate if you do. I'm really very interested in the impact of 5 and 6 of the recommendation. In a former life, I was parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Environment, and one of the pieces of legislation that I helped shepherd through Parliament was the Species at Risk Act. So I really like that the woodland removal activities be undertaken in compliance with the Migratory Birds Convention, and further that woodland removal activities be undertaken in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And I guess I'm just looking for clarification on what that implication is. So for instance, Mr. Kuta talked about, I think it was some flora that was there. I forget exactly what it was. And previous delegations talked about birds and wildlife. If this indeed is their habitat, how does that impact the permission to remove some of these trees?
I can try to answer that, Madam Chair. So normally under our bylaw, we are unable to enforce those particular acts, and that's why the wording is that it be done in compliance with the Endangered Species Act and the Migratory Birds Convention Act. So they have very specific requirements as to how the work is to be undertaken. And again, that's essentially left to the person doing the work in the area that they meet with those requirements. So we can definitely enforce things that are within the tree bylaw, but we cannot enforce those other activities, but we can sort of draw attention to it. And that's normally the way that we do these things. Yeah, I think, again, that it's up to the person doing the work to make sure that they're complying with that.
Kate, do you have anything to add, or is that pretty much the limit of our authority?
Yeah, that is the limit of our authority. And in terms of the information known on site, there isn't an inventory existing in terms of any additional species that would be on that site at this point in the process.
Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Seem to be suffering from Jim's problem. Sorry, just more process questions, and I apologize for them, but this isn't something that I think this may have come before us once before in my term on my terms on council, if that. So I'm kind of struggling to understand where the pieces all fit together and where we fit in. If we were to say, just for the sake of hypothetical argument, no to this permit, would that not be essentially saying no to development of the land altogether? Do we have the authority to do that? Is that something that we're doing to all applications for woodland clearing? I'm just trying to understand where this fits.
Albert?
Yeah, so the woodland removal permits, we've issued a number of them recently. They're generally for plantations, and like I said, plantations are a bit of a odd piece in the whole forestry forest management business, in that they're essentially planted as crops. So we will issue, and we have issued, removal permits for plantations. We have never issued a woodland removal permit for like a mixed hardwood forest, as we find in the ESPA. And again, that's, like I say, it's because plantations fit in a little bit differently. If the permit was turned down, the application, the applicant could still apply for a development, like development application on the property. And the trees could still be removed through that process as well. Once there's a development application on the property, the tree bylaw gets kicked out. There's a line in there that if there's a development application on a property, the tree bylaw is no longer applicable. So they kind of get excluded at that point. And there's no development application on this property at this point, and that's why the tree bylaw is in effect.
Okay. Honestly, that just leads me to more questions, but I'll think about them.
Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, my question is, when this process starts, or if we agree to this, is the information passed on to the necessary ministries to enforce the activities?
We don't pass that information on ourselves, but again, because sort of the activities are sort of known, so there is some scrutiny, probably not as close as with the tree bylaw, where we have regional staff sort of driving by the property at all times. But yeah, so it's not actively passed on to those ministries.
Well, thank you. Maybe that's a avenue that should maybe be undertaken, so to make sure that they are aware. Then we've done our due diligence to allow that to be scrutinized in the future. Take some of the weight off your shoulders, Albert.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
I think I'd like to ask a follow-up question of Councillor Clark's. I think we're all struggling with this because we all love trees, and I actually have walked around this property, so I know exactly what we're talking about. And when Kevin Tomlinson was talking about the elevation, he must have better eyesight than I do if he can see to Guelph and all the way to Mount Forest. But it is quite an interesting property. But further to Councillor Clark's question of clarification, were we to turn this down and they were to apply for a building permit or a zone change, and that were to go through, what would that do to the buffer zones that we are now saying need to be in place? Would that all be thrown out the window? I guess we would have to approve this application, and it would put into practice those buffer zones. But what would happen if there was a zone change or a development application?
At that point, it would go through the city of Waterloo, and they would negotiate similar sorts of things or possibly different. But yeah, it would be up to the city with their planning staff.
Thank you. So I see everybody looking very thoughtful. We do have a recommendation before us. Albert, thank you very much for your excellent work, and Kate for answering some hard questions. Councillor Clark.
Thank you. So the long-term goal is a development application, but one hasn't been submitted. Why is the application for the woodland removal happening at this time?
You would probably have to ask the consultant as to the timing of that. So.
I see Kate waving.
Yeah, sorry, I just use my hand in the proper fashion. Through you, Chairman. Typically, when lands are designated for development, then sitting in the holding pattern, awaiting future development, they are more often than not actively farmed. And one of the reasons why that is to maintain the full development potential of those lands. And so we would see if there was a core feature on site, the boundaries of that core feature being maintained and the property not being naturalized in any way over time. That is fairly typical practice within the region. This property is somewhat unique in that it was being held with its development potential as a plantation that over time has naturalized. And so I think that it's a fairly unique circumstance. Typically, a property like this would have been actively farmed in the interim.
So from that, do I understand that the clearing is a harvesting, or is it simply a removal?
I would think if there is value in the wood, that value would be realized, but because of the deterioration, because the woodlot had not been maintained as a plantation over time, that value was lower than could have been.
Yeah, I think at this point it's very low quality in terms of any value. It's mostly if you're going to use it for something, it would be firewood. Like there's no lumber quality material out there.
Further questions, Councillor Clark?
No, but I wonder whether if the IBI group or WSP can explain why the application is coming for the just at this time and in this order. I'm just not understanding. Again, I'm just not understanding why this application is here if the development is happening at some time in the future, and if the development application will render the need for this application unnecessary anyway.
So I recall Jeff Gross from WSP was one of the first delegates, and I think he said he was here to answer hard questions. So, Mr. Gross, if you're still here, this is your hard question. Would you like to speak to it?
Sure. Just getting myself off mute there. My understanding is that the proponent is applying for this application now just to remove some uncertainty with respect to potential future development potential. So it's a treat area that we've provided an opinion on and supporting materials for the permit, but there's still uncertainty with respect to potential future land use and development.
Thank you.
Okay. Colleagues, I see no further questions. We do have a recommendation, and that is that the Regional Municipality of Waterloo issue a woodland removal permit to Russ Howell for the removal of approximately 3.65 hectares of black walnut, white pine plantation located at 515 Herb Street Road, Waterloo, subject to the following conditions. And those are the buffer strips that Albert pointed out to us. That's I and 2I. 3I is a buffer established at the west end of the plantation adjacent to the core environmental feature, and that the buffers and retained areas are to be flagged and clearly demarcated to the satisfaction of regional staff prior to commencement of any tree removals. Part 5 was all woodland removal activities be undertaken in compliance with the Migratory Bird Convention Act, ideally during a non-breeding winter period. And 6 is that all woodland removal activities be undertaken in compliance with the Endangered Species Act, and that this permit not pertain to stump removals and/or site grading. Colleagues, I am in your hands. Do we have a mover? Moved by Councillor Armstrong. Do we have a seconder? Moved by Councillor Erb. Any further discussion? I would call for the vote then. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you, colleagues. And I have to agree with Councillor Clark. This is a very interesting process to go through. Again, I'd flag that there has been correspondence 1 through 9 as point 4 on our agenda. Is there any other business? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. You guys don't want to adjourn? Okay, moved by Councillor Erb, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. You can just show a show of hands if you're prepared to adjourn. Thank you, colleagues. And Kate, thank you very much. Albert, thank you very much. And for any of the delegations that are still in the room, thank you for creating some thought-provoking comments for us to consider. Everybody have a great day. This meeting is now adjourned.